Today's discussion will be presented in three segments since we are recording this session for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Our first segment will focus on understanding the key drivers in legislation to use multi-year leases and government-owned payloads on commercial satellites. Also, explain procurement methods to curtail cost and ensure availability of sufficient satellite communications. The next segment will describe the impact of increased use of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance applications on SATCOM requirements. And lastly, we'll detail the purchasing of both MilSatCom and commercial SATCOM to streamline cost and effectively plan for availability. Feel free to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to get them answered online. We are particularly pleased to welcome our moderator, Jason Miller, Executive Editor and Reporter for Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Let me turn over the reins to Jason to begin today's discussion.
Welcome to our panel discussion today on what's on an emerging challenge for the Defense Department and soon an emerging challenge for a lot of other agencies too. Our guests today are Douglas Lavero, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy at the Defense Department, retired Navy Vice Admiral Lyle Bien, Justin Johnson, the Military Legislative Assistant to Congressman Doug Lamborn, and retired Air Force Brigadier General Tip Osterthaler, the President and CEO of SES Government Solutions. Before we get started, I'd like to set some context for our discussion today. Congress acknowledges the need for new acquisition approaches for DoD's procurement of critical satellite communications capability. In the fiscal 2014 Defense Authorization Act, lawmakers encouraged new acquisition models that will both help reduce costs for this capability and help reduce risk of not having sufficient commercial satellite communications where and when the military needs it. So why is Congress worried about DoD's acquisition of commercial satellite communications, or ComSatCom? Well, as Congressman Mike Rogers, the chairman of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Strategic Forces, wrote in a recent op-ed piece in Space News, DoD's process is inefficient because they're too often buying on the spot market using one-year leases. Buying on the spot market is defined as buying for cash at the current price. Now, this is opposed to buying over a long term and receiving better prices, or even as a managed service where you, if you will, pay by the drink. DoD mostly buys SATCOM services on the spot market to support troops in theater when they need extra bandwidth immediately. Now, Rogers says DoD spent about $1 billion in 2011, the latest figures that are available for ComSat services. And in fact, the Defense Business Board found in a report issued just last year that DoD buys about 40% of its commercial satellite communication services from the commercial market. Now, of that, the Defense Information Systems Agency buys 75% of those through one-year leases and 25% through the spot market. The Defense Business Board also found that DISA expenditures for ComSat services is expected to grow to between $3 billion and $5 billion over the next 15 years. On top of what many believe is overspending by DoD, the problem also is who DoD is buying these services from. As DoD shifts to the Asia-Pacific region, it may rely on commercial satellite services from countries or providers that aren't necessarily considered friendly to the United States. Congressman Rogers writes that buying from countries or providers in countries such as China or India who may not have the best interests in the United States in mind could cause some real problems. Now, this is a growing concern for both DoD and lawmakers as both cyber attacks and the stealing of data continues to grow. Retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General William Donahue wrote in an op-ed in Space News in February 2012, there are other approaches. He says one of them is for DoD to develop a long-term strategy to buy commercial satellite services. Donahue says the collaboration between DoD and the General Services Administration on the future ComSatCom services contract is a good start. That contract offers mobile, fixed, and broadcast satellite services. The Defense Business Board offered 7 traditional and non-traditional approaches to commercial satellite services, such as buy lease or anchor tenancy. The DBB also offers 10 near-term and long-term recommendations, including designating a single lead for ComSatCom strategy development and implementation. So with that background in place, let's get the conversation started. Once again, our guests today are Douglas Lavero, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy at the Defense Department, retired Navy Vice Admiral Lyle Bien, Justin Johnson, the Military Legislative Assistant to Congressman Doug Lamborn, and retired Air Force Brigadier General Tip Osterthaler, the President and CEO of SES Government Solutions. So let's start with some basics. A lot of background I know I gave there. This is a topic that can be complicated and a lot of details. Let me turn to Doug Lavero from DoD. What is the current approach for commercial satellite services? Give us how it was developed this way, and also define there are different kinds of satellite services. There's ComSatcom, military Satcom, and government Satcom. So Doug, take us away.
Sure, Jason. Thanks very much. I appreciate it, and thank you for calling us together today. Let me start where you just left off there, and let me differentiate between two different kinds of services: the so-called ComSat services, or commercial satellite communication services, and MilSatcom services, the militarily provided satellite communication services. The military services are provided on satellites that the government owns and operates, buys, designs specifically for warfighting needs. Some of your listeners may be familiar with some of the names. In the past, we used to have names like the Defense Communications Satellite System, or DISCUS, or the MilStar, Military Satellite Communication System. These days, we have what's called the Wideband Global Satcom System and the Advanced Extremely High Frequency System. These are DoD-owned and operated systems. They are designed for warfighting needs specifically. They have specific features on them that differentiate them from normal commercial satellites. Unfortunately, we can't buy all of our satellite services, or we can't buy enough satellites to support all the warfighting needs. Just as the communication needs of the general public have increased over the last 2 decades from the 25 kilobits or 24 kilobits we used to get on our phone to 7.5 megabits per second internet connections and the streaming 4G video that we see, the same has happened on the DoD side, and so we've seen a huge uptick in the amount of communications that warfighters need and deserve in order to go ahead and conduct operations, either humanitarian operations or combat operations. So to fill in the gap between what we've provided through the military purchasing of satellites and the need that has been identified, we go ahead and turn to the commercial world. Now, this is a place where the commercial world is ideally suited to meet the DoD's needs, because commercial Satcom is one of the most lucrative and well built out infrastructures within the satellite market for the civilian world. Commercial Satcoms number well over 400, owned by both international consortia and individual industries. And we turn to those satellites to go ahead and fill in that difference that I spoke about. It turns out that difference has grown over time, and today almost 80% of our communications is actually handled by commercial Satcom. That really grew during the Gulf conflicts recently, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we have seen the cost go up to the DoD as articulated by Congressman Rogers. So certainly, I think we all understand that we need to figure out a better way to go ahead and use those services, and that's what the Department of Defense is about right now.
So one thing that you brought up was the difference in capabilities in terms of the bandwidth. One thing I read recently was a lot of the DoD satellites are on the lower side of that gigabit per second, or that the way they measure how much bandwidth there is versus the commercial satellites, which are on the upper end. Is that part of the reason why you guys are also turning to commercial satellite services?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's actually two differences that are important here, and maybe the other panel members can help as well, but let me just say it from the DoD perspective. One difference is the absolute bandwidth that a satellite can carry. Some of the more modern commercial satellites can carry well over 100, 120, 150 gigabits per second on a single satellite, where even our most capable military satellite can only go ahead and carry 3 gigabits per second. But there is also a difference in the exact capability that we can provide for a single user. So, for example, most commercial satellites are limited to a certain bandwidth for each channel, normally about 36 or 52 megahertz, which means far less than a gigabit per second. For the wideband global Satcom satellite, if we have a unmanned aerial vehicle that has a camera in it that has a wideband with a video feed, we actually can't do that for the capability we want over a commercial satellite, but we can use some of our military satellites to do that. So designed for different purposes, for different sets of users, and yet we need them both to support DoD operations.
All right, let me turn to Admiral Bien for a second. Talk about this idea of the commercial satellite market and the military satellite market, and more broadly, because it also has to do with what DoD does in space. So many different capabilities that go through that.
I think there's a couple of points that are worth making relative to Mr. Lovaro's points as DoD confronts this age-old question of what fraction of their communications should be carried over government satellites as compared to that fraction that would be handled by commercial. If you look at the majority of communications that take place on a daily basis, whether it's the president or a truck driver somewhere in Iowa, their communications consist largely of landlines or terrestrial communications, cellular networks, 100% of which are operated in this country and virtually in all countries in the developed world by commercial operators. So I think it's worth noting that when people like Doug Lavaro make decisions about the government fraction versus the commercial fraction, that's a issue that's unique to space-based communications. We've long ago decided not to have that argument about terrestrial communications. That's one. The second point is while this panel was constituted to talk about space-based communications, the fact of the matter is that nations like ours profit in scores of ways that go beyond communications or that are at least somewhat unique. There's navigation and timing, without which the cellular networks around the world wouldn't work, without which trains would not run, not only not on time, in many cases wouldn't run at all because they're automated through really precision timing. Entertainment and weather and intelligence, all of those things that I think we come to, because they have been done for so long and for so well, we tend to somewhat take them for granted. Ditto for space-based communications, which, by the way, is a supporting element for virtually all of those other capabilities and issues that nations like ours and governments like ours depend upon. So I thought it was, well, even though we're here to talk about communications, I think we should understand that without space-based communications, so many other elements of space support would not function.
Let me turn to Tip Osterthaler from SES for a second. One of the things about, because I want to go back to the communications piece, one of the things about the speed issue, the 100 gigabit per second versus the 3 gigabit per second, define what that means from a user's perspective. Is it just a longer wait time to get information, or what?
No, not necessarily. These measures of throughput for satellites measure the amount of data that you can send in a data stream. So if you have a live video data stream, particularly something like an HD, high-definition video data stream, that takes a lot of throughput to be able to push that through a transponder or a single carrier on a satellite. If you're just doing a voice communication, that takes a relatively small amount of bandwidth. So you're just measuring the amount, the size of the pipe that you're using to send a data stream.
But as communications have gotten more complex, more technologies rely on that communication link. Is that why that the need for the higher bandwidth is so important?
You know, it measures the quantity of information that you can send on any given satellite carrier, and that's important. As people develop applications, they tend to want to make them more and more sophisticated, carry more and more data. If it's video, it's higher resolution. If it's other sorts of data applications, to be able to send a richer data stream. And so everybody that develops applications, whether they're going to travel on satellites or some other method, is sort of insensitive to this background infrastructure need. They're not concerned about that. They're trying to build the best application they can. But the people who provide the background infrastructure that have to carry this data, satellite or otherwise, have to be concerned about that. All
right, let me turn to Admiral Bien.
So Tip's point is exactly correct, that everybody, whether it's a private citizen or a government official, seems to be in this mad rush to provide services that consume more and more bandwidth. Yesterday it was a phone call, today it's a video teleconference, and the list goes on. And for right behind that is high-definition TV in every op center around the world. So there's no question that we are moving in a direction of more and more bandwidth. But I think essential to your question is that when companies like TIPS respond to those requirements or those wishes on the part of the consumer, whether they're government or civilian, in the course of doing that, they build satellites that probably cost about the same money as the satellite that preceded them that had a lot less capacity. So now that he's moved up the frequency chain and up the capacity chain, he can sell a unit of service at a far lesser price than he could in the old days when he was confined by the amount of service that he could provide.
All right, let me turn to Justin Johnson from Congressman Lamborn's office a little bit. What's the concern on Capitol Hill? Based on what we're hearing, are you getting, for instance, constituencies coming to your office saying, when I'm in theater, this was such a struggle to get more communication, more bandwidth, or this is a matter of saving lives? Give me the thought process going on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think it's all of the above. Absolutely, I have friends who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the stories they'd say of, the data that they can get through, the struggles they have to get information, whether they're on a base just trying to talk with their wives and kids, or whether they're, outside the wire shooting. There's real challenges there, and commercial SATCOM has had a huge impact in alleviating some of those challenges. But the other, I think the other major reason Congress has become interested is the potential savings. I think we all know that the Pentagon is facing real budget constrictions, and as you alluded to or outlined in your introductory remarks, there's real money that the Pentagon is spending appropriately to get good commercial SATCOM service, but it seems pretty clear that we can take some steps to spend that money better, to buy those same services or potentially even more services for the same or less cost. And hey, in this day and age, you got to save every penny.
Especially when you're talking about the cost, so even if it's $1 billion a year in 2011. I mean, real quick, Doug Lavaro from DoD, is there any new figures that you can shed some light on in terms of how much DoD spends? Is the Defense Business Board fairly accurate at $1.6 billion?
Yeah, Jason, this is one of those hard numbers to get a hold of. I think the $1 billion a year number is a number that we think is probably pretty good. It's probably better to look in the long term. Will this number go up or down? And I think the Defense Business Board is correct. This number is probably going to go up. So it's certainly going to be more than $1 billion into the future. If you'll let me add on one thing that we didn't talk about earlier, and it kind of goes to the point you asked both Justin and Tip, what kind of drives this need. The other big change that we've had within the DoD is the number of forces that we send forward to a conflict versus those that we keep at home. Many people know that our, for example, unmanned aerial vehicle operations are all done by SATCOM from folks stationed in the United States. We've been able to cut down on both the number of forces and the number of forces deployed into a theater, and that saved lives, that saved a lot of money as well. But where that money ends up being needed then is to go ahead and communicate between where the forces are located and where the operations are being conducted. So that drives a lot of this increase as well. And it's important, I think, just as Justin said, to protect lives, to provide the connectivity for the families that's necessary in these long war years that we've had, and also to make sure that our warfighters have the best information available at their fingertips.
All right, on that note, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the panel discussion, Satellite Communications, Acquiring SATCOM in Tight Times, sponsored by SES Government Solutions on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM.